He's the cybernetic strategic studies researcher. He's from a university in Iran. Now, as usual, people will, if they want to, will just dismiss anything coming from Iran or anybody that your mommy, daddy, government tell you not to listen to. But understand what he's saying here. Okay. And this is a cybernetic strategic studies researcher, right? So whether you want to disregard him or not, the guy has the right the education to be able to speak on these things. And he says domestic and international statistics show a strange jump in the spread of the virus in Iran compared to 80 other countries in the world. Now, think about what we just said in regard to China and Italy, right? Same thing. Now, genome sequencing tests prove the structure of the virus with the virus 79.5% confirm the SARS was made from the U.S. in 2002. There's minor translation issues because we're translating this, as you can see. But the point is, it's basically obvious ties to SARS. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Here's where he says, announcing the opinion of biologists in China. Oh, actually, that's the middle one. I'll read all three. There was actually number 11 I wanted to read. But announcing the opinion of biologists in China, Iran, Russia, and several international officials cite such as Global Dynasty on the Americanization. According to biology and genetic experts, the prevalence chart in Italy is smaller to that in Iran, designed to influence Iranians. Then it says, because Iranians and Italians have the closest genome sequence to each other. Well, you don't say. He says that's to say whatever affects Iranian genetics will also affect Italians, and vice versa. To announce the US CDC against Iran has increased the world's media outcry, and he goes on to keep talking. But really let that sink in. So if you want to find an explanation for why Italy is suddenly suffering from just as much, as serious as Iran, well, that certainly begins to make sense, doesn't it? Right? Especially when you recognize that right now, Italy has more deaths by far than Iran. Okay? Even the ratio, right? Which is really ridiculous when you remember that very recently recognize that people, and they're still doing it, Iran's hiding something. They can't handle this. It's all Iran, bad guy, and they don't know what they're doing. Oh, every case came from Iran. Gee, I wonder why they would be selling that obviously false idea. Maybe because they knew where it came from. But understand that they were screaming this because look at the deaths to the cases. Why is Iran so much more severe? They must be hiding something. Where are the same calls about Italy? You don't see it today. I've said this already, but recognize that. That's just so incredibly dishonest. If they were that concerned, they would say it about Italy too, but they don't because it's not actually that they're concerned. They're just trying to attack Iran in the midst of this chaos. And then you realize that possible the reason it's so intense is because it was tailored that way. Interesting to think about. I find that to be hard to ignore. That Italy has approximately the same fatality rate as China, 3 times that as other nations, while Iran specifically has the highest rate. The Brussels Times, Chinese researchers discovered 2 separate strains. Look what it says right here. First of all, it's saying that the research involves 103 coronavirus specimens. Scientists found that the virus had undergone 149 mutations. Totally natural. It evolved in 2 subtypes, L and S. 70% of them were L, 30% S. I'm not sure what that means. But researchers believe that the type S, which more closely resembles the virus found in bats, guess what? Is actually an older version of the coronavirus and is less aggressive. So you're telling me, specifically the one that's tied to bats, is older. You know what that suggests? You know what that tells you? Coming from bats, that the U.S. government has actively researched for a long time, it's not some organic thing, at least part of it. This lends credence to exactly what I've been saying. The fact that it's possible that this was something that was happening and then something was altered and created and used in the midst of it, right? Well, we've got an outbreak going on. Let's make a quick thing and throw it at Iran so we can pretend it's part of the same thing, right? They've already been working on coronaviruses for decades. We all know that. The patents and things they're working on, they're making coronavirus bioweapons. So how hard would it be for them to throw out this older version of it and attack Iran with it right in the midst of everything? You know, and or maybe maybe this was just some small thing and they decided to carry out some aggressive attack and it backfired and blew up and it's all over the place now. I mean, there's any number of things you could look at. But when it says it's an older version, tell me that does not directly contrast everything we're hearing. Oh, this new novel thing that we have no idea about. It's totally brand new. Must have come from animals. Oh, except for 30% of it is an actual older version. There's no way. That means somebody did something here that planted this. I mean, you don't just all of a sudden catch the same older one. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Sure, anything is possible, as always. But recognize what this is showing you. At the very least, that the narrative is wrong, that what they're trying to shove down your throat is not exactly what's happening. Now, this virologist we're talking about, he stated that the U.S. government had recently had more than 200 pulmonary fibrosis cases very recently that apparently resulted in death due to patients' quote inability to breathe, but whose conditions apparently and their symptoms couldn't be explained by pulmonary fibrosis. Now, wouldn't you think in the midst of this outbreak, you might be like, hey, maybe this is something else. Maybe that's why we can't explain, why we can't identify it with the very thing that we're saying it is. Like, that's just crazy. But the 200 cases of pulmonary fibrosis where they died because they couldn't breathe. Now, he said he wrote articles informing the U.S. health authorities to consider seriously that those deaths are resulting from the coronavirus. So he literally wrote to them and said, look, these may be coronavirus, trying to do good for them and say, hey, you're mistaken. But what do you think they did? They responded by blaming the deaths on e-cigarettes. Yeah, you heard that right. They blamed the death of these people on vaping and then apparently silenced further discussion. Now, I couldn't believe this, especially when you choose to jump over here and take a look at the website itself and see what they have to say about this. This is from CDC. Outbreak of lung injury associated with e-cigarettes. Now, we all heard this story. That's been ongoing, right? The idea that all these people are dying from mysterious deaths, from all these random things that we can't identify. Well, it must be those evil vaping, or the synthetic weed or whatever they tried to make it about. And this just didn't make any sense. Of course, when you find out, as they say, as of February 18th, 2020, a total of 2,807 hospitalized eval cases or deaths have been reported to the CDC from all 50 states. Gee, and of course, that just has to be vaping, right? 68 deaths have been confirmed in 29 states as of February 18th. Now, is it not possible that what we're staring at are coronavirus deaths that are being hidden under the guise of some unknown vaping illness that actually has the exact same symptoms and same problems as all the things we're pointing to? Sure, that's certainly possible. It becomes even more interesting once you realize that this is what they're saying. Right? This is what this virologist said, that look, these cases are not pulmonary fibrosis, right? That these are all the symptoms of coronavirus. And then that's why they just, of course, looked into it and responded, professionally and said, well, thank you for your, nope. They just told him to shut up and they silenced the discussion. Because that's what you do when you're an honest investigator concerned about an actual outbreak, right? I mean, wouldn't you think that they would at the very least look into it? The Taiwanese doctor then stated that the virus outbreak began earlier than assumed. He said, quote, we must look to September of 2019. Now, he stated the case in September of 2019 where some Japanese traveled to Hawaii and returned home infected. People who had never been to China. This was 2 months prior to the infections in China. And just after the CDC suddenly shut down the Fort Detrick bioweapons lab, claiming the facilities were insufficient to prevent loss of pathogens. Remember that story? You should, because we just talked about it. Whitney Webb just covered it in this story, and I covered it when I talked about it on the show. They shut down Fort Detrick, the most nefarious, infamous bioweapons lab research in the world that's been behind some of the most disgusting experiments on people and foreign countries and Americans. I've gone through it. And this was the exact time frame when they shut it down because they had leaks. Please recognize the gravity of that statement. Now, he said he personally investigated, the virologist, that those cases, he said he personally investigated those cases very carefully as did the Japanese virologists who came to the same conclusion, mind you. Those are the Taiwanese and Japanese, not China. Now, this might indicate the coronavirus had already spread in the United States, but where the symptoms were being officially attributed to, other diseases, and thus possibly masked or, possibly completely suppressed and covered up. Fort Detrick is the one I was talking about. I've talked about it on this show before. I recommend you look into it. Just look up some of my shows on the past look up the one I talked about, the U.S.'s long and sordid history of bioweapons research. I go through the whole damn thing. It's pretty horrifying.